Well, I can imagine that in a time of turmoil in Brazil, everything is focused on the situation in Brazil. If you look at the Financial Times on Monday, you'll find this as a title. But you see also that other parts of the world have difficulties as well. That is the article directly underneath, which means that in Germany, there's a big push towards the right of the political spectrum. And not only in Germany, but in most other European countries as well. And this is directly related to the process of immigration. So the process of immigration, these flows, have immediate domestic political repercussions. Before I go on, I'll just tell a little bit about myself. You introduced me already by German background, but more than half of my life I've spent now in the Netherlands. It is not a big change for you, it would just be suburban traffic. Actually, it's so nearby. With a background in political science, economics, and in law, I have shared international relations for 30 years, and afterwards created the Network University for international online learning. And one of the programs that we give, that Network University provides, is a program on migration and development. So in how far migration either contributes to development or sometimes also can be an obstacle to development. That is also the framework that brought me here to Brazil. But I will not talk about that. You all know more, and certainly Adriana knows much more about that, about the migration to Brazil, the migration from Brazil. Some of the aspects are quite similar. So at the end, I would like to ask you of what Europe can learn from Brazil, because we have such a long tradition of immigration and integrated such large groups of immigrants into society. But I first want to start just with some basic facts about immigration into Europe. Some basic figures. But I would immediately say that in this field, as in many other fields of social sciences, figures, statistics are used as weapons. And many of these figures are not really reliable because they are collected for specific political purposes. So we always have to be a little bit careful, especially if we see very exact figures up to the last digit. That always makes me a little bit suspicious. Then to look a little bit at the impact on domestic politics that it has in Europe. Then the relations with other areas of geopolitics. Since many of you are students of international relations, I assume. And then I come back to the question of what can Europe learn from Brazil. Now, the actual crisis in Europe is due to the very fact that we had this enormous surge of immigration. That last year, immigration doubled from something like a little bit more than 600,000 to 1.3 million. So that is a tremendous amount, and it is the largest migration movement in Europe since the Second World War and the migration that was caused by the war. So Greece alone receives 2,000 refugees a day. And if you look at Athens, the capital of Greece, then you'll see it's a city of about 3 million people, that in Greece alone, you have about 1 million migrants that have stranded there. So you can imagine that this is a very considerable challenge. There has been quite a shift in the migration routes to Europe. In former times, many people crossed the Mediterranean either into Spain or many into Italy. But we can see that for the last year, for 2000, that by far the most important via Turkey into Greece, and then onwards through the Balkan towards Central Europe. And this is through countries which very often just do not have the infrastructure to cope with such an enormous stream of people. Many people, many migrants don't succeed to reach the European shore in the very first place. This is the death toll of the people who did die in the Mediterranean because they. You see dramatic figures, and this creates also the urgency of the crisis. If nothing is done, Europe is also the cause for hundreds of deaths almost every day. In the sense that these are numbers that many of the civil wars in other countries, of the numbers comparable to the casualties in these civil wars. So there's an enormous urgency to do something very quickly. And you may have seen the picture, because that really went around the world, of this little boy. And it underlines the drama of the situation, but it also underlines the power of the press and the power of pictures. I think that this picture has increased the urgency and the pressure on European politicians to do something about it more than any political discussion. Because that really moved people and made them convinced that they really have to change something and have to adapt it. Then the question is, why is it so difficult to prevent that, to change the situation? So we see that Europe has had a very mixed policy. Keep out, change, bienvenue, défense d'entrée, welcome, always kind of very mixed policy. In some countries more like that, some countries more like that. Big difficulty to agree among the member countries of the European Community. And it's a little bit easier to understand that if you see that are affected in quite a different way by these migration flows. Just by the sheer numbers of people, these are the total claims for asylum. Well, there are many people who come who do not ask for it in the first place. So they remain in a kind of legal circuit if they can. But if they have been registered, they ask for them. That more than all the other countries together wanted to go to Germany and also reach Germany. So it has quite a prominent position in it, which also explains why some pressure on the other European countries comes from Germany in order to share the burden of share the financial implications of that. Now, why has Germany been more welcoming than many other of the European countries? I think that there are three basic reasons for that. The very first reason is an historical one. Germany had, after the Second World War, had dramatic refugee streams out of the former eastern part that then became part of Poland, and out of the part that became the GDR, became Eastern Germany, who went to the West. So in many families, they have the direct family experience of people who had to flee violence, who were exposed from their country. So this is one of the historical, and some of that is quite recent, because until the fall of the Berlin Wall, you still had a steady stream of people who tried to escape the DDR and go to the West. The second aspect, that Germany, with a relatively flourishing economy, needed labor. And many of the Germans became better educated and were hesitant to do the kind of manual labor, so people were also welcome for that reason. There's also kind of psychological reason. That Germany, which had caused so many problems during the first half of the 20th century, that for many people it was a kind of release that once, at least in history, there would be the good guys to welcome people. So that might have contributed to this attitude. Probably you all have heard these three words from "Wir schaffen es," we can, what Angela Merkel said. And this has led to tremendous problems within Europe. Because all the other governments said, well, how could you? How could you invite more or less people to come in even greater numbers than were already on their way? Because that is a burden for us all. So it has created enormous problems among European countries. And as you can imagine, it has also created enormous problems within Germany. To understand the differences between the different European countries even better, if you look not only at the total numbers of refugees, but if you relate the total numbers to the number of inhabitants of a specific country. So this is statistics of how many asylum applications per 100,000 inhabitants of a country you have. So to relate it a little bit to the size of the population, because then you get different statistics. Then you see that Hungary has by far, relatively speaking, the largest influx of refugees. Also, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, the Scandinavian countries, have absorbed proportionally more people than Germany did, but also Austria, especially because among the first three are Hungary and Austria. That explains why these were also countries that closed their borders at the beginning. Well, this is, we just can't cope with it with these numbers compared to the infrastructure that we have, compared to the number of inhabitants that we do have. So at that moment, you've got a lot of what people are afraid of, that actually borders will be reconstituted within Europe. Now if I travel from the Netherlands to Germany, there's a little sign alongside of the road that here was a border, or here is a border. The Netherlands, here ends the Netherlands and Germany starts. That's all what you see. So there's no, you don't see any controls any longer. You just see a little bit that the color of the street signs change. That is the difference. If you go to Belgium, to France, to Italy, it is the same. You don't have any controls any longer. It has given an enormous boost to the European economy. Because otherwise, always all the trucks had to line up in order to go through customs, and that was a tremendous additional cost for all kinds of companies. So one of the victims, beside the migrants who become victims of the problem, would be the borderless space of Europe. That is what many people fear, and I come back to that a little bit later on. You can now understand also why Germany exercises a special pressure on other countries. This is a map of Europe where for every country the national colors of the country are shown where the largest amount of imports come from. So we see that for all these countries, Germany is most important exporter to these countries, which means that Germany has a special interest to keep the European space open, because it wants to export its products without any obstacles. Very interesting that Germany itself gets most of it from the Netherlands. That's a small neighbor country. I think it's a nice depiction of the concrete position of. The second aspect, which is extremely important for the whole discussion about migration, it cannot really be separated from that, is that the large majority of immigrants are Muslim. If you look at these are the 10 most important countries where refugees come from. And with the exception of Ukraine, which is dominated by the Orthodox Ukrainian Church, all countries are almost purely Muslim countries, all have kind of half and half position, like Albania, Eritrea, and Nigeria, which have a mixed population between Christians and Muslims. But by far the most important groups come from Islamic countries. And this has created a dramatic discussion within Europe. Where in two important countries, in the last months, two important events did take place, which had a dramatic impact on this situation. One were the Paris attacks in November, which came on top of the attacks to Charlie Hebdo a couple of months earlier, which had a very, very important impact on the collective psychology of France. And an event which was violent enough, but not with this kind of deadly violence, which took place at New Year's Eve in Cologne in Germany, had for the Germans a similar kind of psychological effect. It was a kind of, during the New Year's night, kind of abuse of several hundred women in Cologne, but also in a number of other large cities in Germany, by groups of immigrants from North African origin. Not where it exactly came from. But it was obviously that these were people that were regarded as having other understanding of relations between men and women, other understanding of the role of women in society. And this had a dramatic impact on how many Germans looked at the big stream of immigrants from Muslim countries. We see that in both countries, this has created a different kind of action. The deadly attacks in Paris led to a rise of the Front National, Marine Le Pen, in France, which became the strongest party in France. And the dominant theme related to immigration is security. That immigration creates security problems because we open our doors to terrorists. That was the message. In Germany, the discussion was not so much about violence because of deadly attacks or terrorism, because Germany until now has not yet experienced kind of large-scale attacks. So it was much more the theme of culture. People are from a very different culture that is directly against our values, with the result that you have a very strong rise of all kinds of right-wing movements in Germany as well. So the effect, the political effect, is a little bit similar, is a big shift towards the right. And I just want to pick up the security aspect. I think here Europe faces a dramatic policy challenge because the way that refugees are dealt with in Europe creates a problem rather than solves it. I think that most of the
people, almost all the people that come, especially from the Eastern Mediterranean, are people who flee the violence, who do not want to have violence. So they're just the opposite of the kind of terrorists that we have. But then very often people spend a very long time in the asylum procedure. They are kept in a kind of detention center, are not allowed to work, are not allowed to integrate them. And these processes can take a very long time, can take 5 years. People become desperate in this kind of situation. They say, but what? I'm wasting my life. A large number of people who come there are actually at your age. They are between 80 and 30 who come. They want to do something with their life. They don't want to be closed up there and unable to move. So actually, this is the kind of breeding ground of people who have come very peaceful, at a given moment get different ideas, and they become receptible, they become vulnerable to more violent ideas, and share ideas as they are propagated by ISIS. So actually, it's not that we import terrorists, we make them ourselves. And that is a message that is not yet clear, I think, to many politicians. If you look at again at the numbers, so there were these 1.3 million applications for asylum. There were in the same year, there were less applications were accepted. That means that more than 1 million people are in this process with a limited chance very often that actually they are accepted. It contributes to the fact that people are disillusioned and vulnerable to more extreme ideas. And what we see that with the rise of national parties, not only in France, not only in Germany, we have many more nationalist, stronger nationalist movements. And this, of course, creates also problems for the European process. We see that many other aspects that have nothing, political aspects that have nothing to do directly with migration, by nationalist thoughts. People want to have more independence from the general process. So this is the process of European integration in fields that have nothing to do with migration itself. It's a kind of spin-off effect of this process. And we can make a kind of scenario of how will this process impact on the European integration. How will that continue in the future? Now we see that very often, this is not only this kind of process of the impact, is not only dependent whether we'll have less migration or more migration, but it is also very much influenced by the fact whether we experience a period of low economic growth or high economic growth. I think that you have the same here in Brazil. The very fact that you have economic crisis also contributes to different change of political ideas that people have. So in the worst case, if you have more migration, for example, by even more violence in the Middle East, and you have low economic growth, in the worst case, it might even lead to the collapse of the European Union. Whereas if there is high economic growth and still more migration, it could have a very different effect. It could be the leverage to enforce new kind of innovative policies in all areas. If there are new migrants and change in the whole education system, you have to find educational methods to adapt large numbers of people more to a highly developed society. So that could create or could stimulate a lot of innovativeness. You have to create housing for many people in a very short time. Could lead to a different kind of architecture in order to so in all kinds of fields that could lead even to new innovation, but also to more integration. Well, if there's less migration, of course, everything will be much less dramatic and slower. And you have, if you low economic growth and less migration, you may have a stagnation process, or a high economic growth, you may have a slow continuing. So the wave of migration also directly affects, together with economic consumption, has a dramatic impact on the future of the economic relations. You may wonder what this would show. Actually, this is a carpet in the hotel room where we spent the last night. But it gave me the idea that actually it is a kind of roadmap of the problems in Europe related. So we see here in the center, we see migration to Europe. Then we see more or less in the northeast that it leads to ruptures that are due to geopolitical struggle with Russia. I'll come back to these issues in a moment. We see that in the southeast, it leads to the special troubles in the relations with Turkey. If you look to the south within Europe, it is closely related to the crisis of the euro. And if you look towards the west, it is directly related with the discussion about the Brexit in Britain. I'll go through these four aspects and describe it in a little bit more detail. First of all, in the tug of war in Eastern Europe. One of the other big problems that European policymakers have to deal with is that in Ukraine you have, in the east of the country, you have an ongoing civil war, which is actually fueled by Russia. As being part of keep either the whole of Ukraine or a large part of it in the Russian sphere of influence. So you have this kind of geopolitical competition between the EU and Russia for influence there. And you also see that the more Eastern European governments get into a distance towards the European Union by the very fact that the European Union wants them to accommodate more migrants. That is one of the very of the hottest issue of partnerships, and drift a little bit more towards Russia, which is easier because the elite, they share very often history with the kind of political elite in Russia. So that is one aspect to which it is related. The second aspect is the drama of the policy towards Turkey. On the one hand, one of the solutions for Europe of the migration crisis was to ask Turkey and to pay Turkey for keeping refugees from Syria there. There are, at this very moment, there are about 3 million refugees from Syria in Turkey. Actually, Turkey has a much larger problem, we can say, than Europe. Many of them would like to go to Europe, and European policy is to subsidize Turkey to keep the refugees there. So it's a very important ally, but not only for keeping refugees within the region, but also as a strategic partner in the fight against ISIS. It's also a strong economic power and an applicant for membership in the European Union. So for all these reasons, very important. So it could be Turkey could be key to the solution of some of the problems. But on the other hand, actually Turkey is involved in a kind of internal war itself, fighting against the Kurds, mainly in the east of the country, after a prolonged, which was relatively peaceful. And actually they are not behaving so much differently from the Syrian government, which wants its own population. So from the human rights perspective, this is not a very good record that they have. And Erdogan's ambition to become a kind of new sultan in Turkey also is not really to be aligned with European standards of democracy either. So it is a big problem between, on the one hand, it is a very important ally in order to help solve the problem. On the other hand, it's a partner that you don't really want to partner with, because in other areas, the partner is behaving so badly. The third problem, which is directly related to it, is the crisis of the euro. See that not in the same way as the Brazilian currency, but in recent years the euro has dropped enormously against the dollar. And part of the crisis is the specific situation in Greece, which has about 300 billion of debt to Europe, which has to be renegotiated. And in order to keep also the stability of the euro, this has to be. But at this very moment, Greece has such a crucial role in the whole map of these refugee streams that the European community has a very big interest in keeping a stable government in Greece. Otherwise, you don't have anybody who is going to organize it. So it cannot enforce any kind of, and will not enforce any kind of measures that would endanger the present government in Greece. So this is the direct link between the migration crisis and the euro crisis. It could endanger perhaps economic stability. So the fourth aspect in the West is, you know, that right from the beginning of the European integration process, Britain was a little bit an odd partner. In the sense they were much more oriented towards the United States, much more oriented towards the Atlantic Ocean, rather than towards the continent. And Britain at this very moment is threatened itself by a kind of fragmentation. Scotland almost voted to become an independent country. Wales want to become more independent. North Ireland has a kind of special status anyway. So even Great Britain itself threatens to be fragmented. It has a very strong anti-EU party. It is at this very moment renegotiating EU membership. But part of this renegotiation is that they don't want more migrants from the rest of Europe. They also don't want to participate in the kind of sharing the incoming migrants and taking their fair share. If you look at this list of countries in Europe that have accommodated and welcomed migrants, Great Britain is very much at the bottom of the whole list. But this antagonizes very much Eastern Europe, because many of the migrants that come to Great Britain come from Eastern Europe. So we have the again started us with in the kind of compass amount of problems with the Eastern European countries taking more distance from Europe. This almost, I'm always coming to the question of what we can learn from Brazil. Now, if you look at what are the big trends, the mega trends in the world, and if you ask ourselves, what will be the impact on migration? Is it just a temporary phenomenon, or will this go on? So global warming will create a lot of environmental refugees. So if it is not war that creates the refugees, it might be global warming in the future that will create a new thing. The second aspect is that we have a kind of secular shift of the population from rural areas to urban areas. And international migration is just a part of this process. Very often also migration is sequential from rural areas to urban areas and then further to international migration. So on the one hand, we will have more migration probably in the future worldwide. The second aspect is the future of work. Especially as highly developed countries experience an increasing degree of automation, which means there's less and less demand for unskilled labor. unskilled factory labor, which is relatively easy to replace, but also less skilled office labor. A large number or large percentage of also office clerks in banks and insurance companies will not be needed any longer 15 years from now. So we have more migration, but in general, the capacity to absorb additional people into the labor market will decline. So what we can expect in the future are more disputes on citizenship. Who can actually share in the wealth of another country? This is a kind of general perspective of the future, but on the basis of that, I would like to ask you what you think is on the basis of the experience of Brazil, of what Europe could be learned. We see that those entered from the Middle East, from the same area, where now a big stream of refugees comes to Europe. 100 years ago, a big stream came here to Brazil. Actually, they're now more or less at the top of society. It's very nicely symbolized by that the Syrian Lebanese hospital is the top ranking, or one of the top ranking hospitals. But a similar change has taken place with the Japanese. So Brazilian society has been able to integrate people coming from all parts of the world very well during the last 100 years. So my question also would be, what has been the recipe for that? Is there anything that is relevant, or would you say, well, world time has changed since 100 years ago? What used to be possible a couple of decades ago is no longer possible there. So I would like to finalize with this question to you, but I am open to all the questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Vamos abrir para perguntas, e quem quer fazer uso da palavra para responder a pergunta, para a professora Adriana. Mas fica à vontade, tá? Eu gostaria de ouvir também algumas ideias de vocês, né, sobre o que fazer, e como vocês perceberam, o pessoal está bastante perdido. E a coisa tende a se agravar bastante. Então, está aberto para perguntas e sugestões. Vamos lá. Vamos pegar 3 perguntas e depois ver a Mana. Espera um segundo, só para eles poderem anotar as perguntas. Não, pode, se você quer fazer em inglês, pode. Se você quer fazer em holandês, também pode. Se não faz em português, você faz em inglês. Eu clico no pacote.
I wanted to read the question, something about the British people. And here we had the immigration group, and because we had racial problems by racism in general. We wanted to import immigrants to whiten, make our population more white. So that's, in my opinion, a main question here. How the immigration was a solution, not a problem. And immigration, the immigrants were always seen as good for their country, not a problem. I guess this is one way that we as a country, and that's something that helps us with integration of the immigrants. So I don't know exactly how our example can help the European. Because it's really different. But I see that Europe is really responsible for the not only for the group of countries that are the leading part for most of the time now, but because they also have something to do with the easy price, because they could have thought that, all right, because at least we have nothing so liquid about the money. So they hold some responsible about that.
Mais duas questões. Vamos lá. Você fala quem você é, do que você está fazendo aqui. Vai falar alto. No, you can speak English. Sorry. Speak up. Tell who you are and what you're doing here.
My name is Titular. I'm just here, and I'd like to personally contact and maybe very early. My question is, what do you ever think about the cultural shock that information with it? I mean, how can the United States view the cultural shock that information without limiting religious freedom and other like people?
Okay. So your question is how to respect the freedom?
How the European states can do the cultural shock without limiting religious freedom from
So European states can relate to Islamic migration without creating a religious problem. Yeah? Tell me, how are you? What are you? Speak up. Louder.
Social human sciences now. Actually, I want to see the answer, not really a question, but I've been researching migration for a while now, and I think some of the information that was given was on the distance between asylum applications and the number of these applications that are denied by the European Union. And we have a similar problem with Brazil. I would like to hear your opinion on that, because I think this problem is due to the artificiality of the asylum concept, the way it is constructed in law and international agreements. It's very old-fashioned, the sole fact of global warming and the possibility of having environmental refugees is a risk, but we also are not prepared to deal with that concept. So I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Okay, last one. Try to fazer outra.
My name is Gabriela. I study
Speak up.
economic here, and my question is related to the division of good guys of Germany and the cheaper labor that the refugees present. How can we understand the good guys if they use the labor of the refugees to bring more money for the
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I'll respond in the reverse order. So I'll start with yours, and then come to the other question. But actually, these are not the same groups. The people who enjoy that Germany now plays a good role are very often born young people, students who are not interested in cheap labor. For them, it's not an argument. But for the Association of Industry in Germany, for them it's an important argument. So these are two different arguments by two different groups, which indeed are not, and you have remarked that quite well, are not really in harmony with each other. But by the way, even cheap labor is not something negative. Yeah, you need people who do some kind of manual work for all of us. All of us need that. And so there is not naturally kind of negative connotation to that. It's more kind of description of levels. And it does also not imply that these people would be nailed down at this position, but they could be upward mobile, they could be educated, and could do something different in the future. So it is not necessarily kind of contradiction, but there is some tension in it that you have very well seen. Then here's a question with regard
to the asylum concept, and that is true. This asylum concept has been defined in the 1950s, and it is really up to revision, especially with the processes of environmental migration in the future. This is a big problem. What is also a problem is that actually to get people, it's also not in the interest of the receiving country, because very often it's described as if it was negative to economic refugees. But very often these are the people who could very well contribute to the country where they go to, and do not have the same economic chances in their own country. So that they might be able to make a better contribution to the country of destination than other groups. So this becomes a big problem, and the very fact, as you said, that it's more and more difficult to see of who is a real refugee, who is fleeing war and persecution, and who is an economic refugee. That also causes these asylum procedures to become so long. If you want to do it carefully, really see what the background is in that specific region, for that specific family, or for that specific group, which creates additional problems. So I think that your suggestion that this really is up to revision is a very pertinent one. The problem is that the political worldwide situation to renegotiate these international agreements is just not there. So I think that everybody would agree that it has to be renewed. It has to be, we need a lot of innovation in that area. But the political situation is totally contrary to that. So that creates and the question with regard to how could be the freedom of religion, how that could be combined. Now, actually, the fear of many Europeans is that the freedom of religion is threatened by the influence of people say, well, anybody could have any kind of religion that they want, but they should leave me with my religion that I have. And whereas but if you leave Islam, go to another, then it could become difficult. So that is more the kind of fear, which is not justified in most situations. The fear that their own religion is threatened. There are countries, and I think that Macedonia at this moment is a case in point, where they say we don't give asylum to people who are Muslim. There, I think you are right. This is an infringement of the right to choose their own religion. One of the problems is that for with Islam, this case is a little bit that part of Islam is also that you don't make a difference between the secular state and religion. Religion is not only private, but that the idea very often is also that the whole society then should be religious, which is basically what extreme interpretation of Islam is like ISIS. Yeah? If you want to have a caliphate, if you want to replace the state by a caliphate, then it is that you infringe the religious freedom of others. So that is a little bit the kind of discussion that you get. It's more the fear that your own religion is threatened rather than the other way around. And then the very first question was that the remark, and I think that is totally right, that historically Europe made a lot of contributions and together with the United States to the situation that created the whole problem in the very first place. And the historical memory here of European countries, European government is very limited. Because for decades, the West has closely cooperated with all kinds of dictatorships in the Middle East. And ISIS and similar kind of movements, in the very first place, were rebellions against these dictatorships. So if these dictatorships had not been maintained for such a long time, probably we would not have a situation right now. So this kind of historical debt has to be acknowledged instead of just not to be discussed. The problem is that even if you acknowledge that, you still have to face the present